Right, hello everyone. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure. Nietzsche is one of these philosophers that many people have heard of. Obviously, many people will have heard quotations from Nietzsche. Some of the famous ones include "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." He also said, "When you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss gazes into you." And perhaps his most famous one, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." So, lots of people have heard of him. He is, however, a notoriously difficult philosopher to read. Not so much because of the conceptual complexity of what he talks about, but because of the style he uses and the rhetoric he uses. Some of his writing takes the form of aphorisms, little bite-sized chunks, little sentences whose meaning is often opaque and whose context is often unclear. He doesn't impose much by way of systematic structure on his writing, so you don't encounter a book by Nietzsche where you'll find him laying out nice and clearly at the start what he's going to cover and in which order and to what end and that sort of thing. We have to kind of cobble together Nietzsche's philosophy piecemeal from different places in a given book, or indeed across different books. His views change over the course of his life, and not necessarily for the better. He has different interests at different stages of his life. He returns to examine different facets of the same subject matter on different occasions, and he descends towards megalomania towards the end of his sane life. He also makes a lot of use of very obscure metaphor. One of my great delights in life is scratching my head about what on earth Nietzsche is on about when he's likening this, that or the other aspect of human existence with all sorts of strange goings-on with eagles and snakes and monkeys and all that sort of thing. Now, the conjunction of all these challenging facts about the way Nietzsche writes has bred many different interpretations of what Nietzsche says, some of which are bonkers. There's an enormous amount of literature written on Nietzsche, some of which is complete and utter garbage. So anyone who's getting to grips with Nietzsche and the debate that he ignites faces a challenge of laying their hands on stuff that's going to be appropriate for them. There are also postmodernist interpretations of Nietzsche, according to which what he's effectively saying is it doesn't matter what you say, there is no right and wrong, there is no truth and falsity. We'll be taking a look at that sort of a line on Nietzsche in due course. Many of Nietzsche's conclusions are challenging, unsettling, unpalatable for some people. He tells us, for example, that the moral code that the likes of us live our lives by is the moral code of the weak. And indeed, we are the weak. He tells us that in terms of our essential nature, not all human beings are the same. Some human beings are higher, other human beings are lower. And he tells us that it's the values and the lifestyles of aristocratic noble types that would be commended. He also seems to have it in various places, Jews, the bourgeoisie, women, and everyone else. That all said, Nietzsche is one of the most richly rewarding philosophers one can hope to read and engage with. He invites us to think about ourselves and our place in the world in ways we may not have considered previously. He invites us to investigate the world around us and to do our philosophy using methodologies that are distinctly different from the ones we're used to using. And ultimately, he invites us to join him in saying a resounding yes to life by imposing our own values and our own meanings on our lives and living our lives to the full in light of those values and those meanings. I'll give you a little quick thumbnail sketch of Nietzsche's life. I won't say that much. He's born in what is now Germany in 1844. He was the son of a preacher man. That explains quite a lot, I think. He's an academic. He's appointed Professor of Philology, which is the study of the nature of language, at the University of Basel in what's now Switzerland. He's appointed a professor at the absurdly early age of 24. So he wasn't a philosopher by training, and he came to philosophy relatively late on in his life. By his own acknowledgement, it was on stumbling across a copy of Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation in a second-hand bookshop while a student at university that his interest in philosophy was first ignited. He retired from academia due to ill health in his mid-30s, and indeed he was a sickly type throughout the whole of his life. And as I've already alluded to, he went irrecoverably insane 11 years before his death. The myth is that his complete mental collapse was triggered when he saw a dying horse at the side of the street and felt pity for it, having spent most of his published works denouncing pity as a very unhelpful and destructive emotion that we'd best studiously avoid. Earlier in his life, he was good chums with Richard Wagner, the composer. Soon changed his mind, didn't like Wagner at all later on in his life. And even though he came to philosophy quite late, he did write prolifically. He wrote prolifically in the 20 years preceding his mental collapse. Lots of books, including a philosophical autobiography with chapter titles like Why I Am So Clever and Why I Write Such Brilliant Books. So, if I'm going to have a theme for the rest of what I say about Nietzsche, it's probably going to be something like this. That for Nietzsche, everything that's important in life is everything to do with us, human beings, and our everyday lived experiences. What's important in life is nothing to do with anything that's independent of human beings and their lived experiences. So distinctly human concerns are central to our practices and institutions, according to Nietzsche, when it comes to questions like the meaning that life has, when it comes to morality, and when it comes to what he has to say about knowledge and the truth. Now, to see how Nietzsche accounts for the first of those topics, the meaning that life has, how he analyses the meaning that life has, I'm going to start with one of the quotations I mentioned at the start. God is dead, and we have killed him. So we're looking at the sort of the middle of the second half of the 19th century, and Nietzsche diagnoses the demise of religion. He reckons religion is on the wane, and certainly relative to the power that religious institutions had in Western Europe up to, say, the 17th century, that's undeniable. So atheism is starting to become more prevalent. And Nietzsche diagnoses the demise, in particular, of Judeo-Christianity and the grip it has on Western culture and people's lives. According to Nietzsche, God is nothing more than a concept that human beings came up with in order to make sense of their lives and, in particular, their suffering. Nietzsche reckons that back in the day, people found it comforting to think that the suffering that occurred in their life was appropriate punishment from the gods, or in the fullness of time, God with a capital G. I suppose if you think back to mankind's earliest times, if one's village is struck by lightning and burns to the ground, then the question, why has this happened? Why has this happened to us? Might not have an answer. And that might be unbearable, unless you tell a story in terms of it being because you have displeased the gods. And if you do right by the gods, by offering them sacrifices, then maybe you can prevent that happening again in the future. So Nietzsche's analysis is that mankind invented the concept of God in order to make their suffering lives understandable and therefore bearable, and in order to wrest back a bit of control over their environment and their culture. With the rise of science, though, in the centuries leading up to Nietzsche's time, Nietzsche recognises that mankind's need for this comforting myth of religion, as he saw it, man's need for that is retreating. Science's ability to allow us to control our environment was replacing the need to appeal to gods or God in order to make our lives comprehensible. And so the need for God is disappearing, and that's why religion is in decline. This brings about a problem, though, as far as Nietzsche is concerned. With the demise of religion, and in particular with the demise of the meaning that religion had traditionally given to people's lives, there's a worry that perhaps life has no meaning, that there's no explanation that can be given for people's suffering in life. And that opens the door, as far as Nietzsche is concerned, to the threat of a wholly pessimistic nihilism, an account according to which life has no value, no meaning, is worthless, and is best turned away from. And that kind of pessimistic nihilism had its champion in the mouth of Nietzsche's great influence, who I've mentioned already, Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer thought that everyday life was indeed irremediably worthless and an evil, and the appropriate response to it is to turn away from it, not by suicide, but by other means. Nietzsche couldn't stand the idea of such pessimistic naysaying. He wanted human beings to really reach for the stars. He wanted mankind to become everything it was capable of being, and he wanted the best types to really achieve cultural heights as far as they were capable of doing. Nietzsche effectively wants to say a joyous yes to life, as he puts it. So Nietzsche wants our lives to have meaning. He wants people to be able to say, yeah, life has value, life is worthwhile. But he rejects any account of the meaning of life that's rooted in any way in the supernatural, so any religious account that invokes a supernatural deity. He also rejects any account of the meaning of life that invokes anything that in any way transcends the basic facts of everyday human existence. So, for example, Nietzsche rejected out of hand the sort of philosophical account that Western philosophers had championed in the centuries leading up to his time, according to which our experiences are one thing, but the real world is something else, independent of us and our experiences. And to find out about the way things really are, we have to get beyond our own experiences and find out about some sort of transcendent or independent realm that's supposed to underlie it. Nietzsche just rejected any notion of anything that transcended our everyday lived experiences. That's all there is, he thought, us and our everyday lives, and we need to react to that appropriately and honestly. Now, thankfully, as far as Nietzsche is concerned, the death of God, it does invite pessimistic nihilism, but it also opens the door to what Nietzsche called a revaluation of values. Traditionally, religious doctrines had underpinned much of morality in Western Europe and beyond. And with the demise of religion, that traditional underpinning was disappearing. And Nietzsche asks, in light of the demise of religion, whether our everyday values that are enshrined in our morality, he asks whether our everyday moral thinking is in fact justified. Is it appropriate for people to live their lives in accordance with the moral doctrines and the moral thinking that we've inherited from our society? And so he asks, where did our moral values come from? Where did our everyday moral code originate from? And his conclusion is that the origins or the genesis of that morality and those moral institutions and practices, far from being something healthy and wholesome, is in fact dark and disreputable. And when we come to recognise this, we'll see that there's actually no justification whatsoever for the best types to live their lives in accordance with the moral code that we ourselves adopt today. So, what Nietzsche reckons the best types should do is to discard our everyday morality and the values that it enshrines, and instead the best type should come up with their own values and their own meanings, and they should impose those values and meanings onto life, and they should live their lives to the full in light of values and meanings of their own devising, rather than blindly or slavishly following values and meanings that are imposed on them by other people. Now, the individual who's capable of doing that, and it's not an easy thing, Nietzsche calls the Superman. The person who's able to rise above the values and the morality of the herd, as Nietzsche puts it, or everyday society, we might say. And the person who can impose their own will onto their life is going to be the person who's in a position to get out of life everything that it has got to offer. It's going to be the person who's going to be in the best place to enjoy the full gamut of potential human experience, and it's going to be the person who's best placed to really reach for the stars in cultural ways and to really flourish. And it's by striving to be supermen that mankind can hope to reach its highest expression. That said, Nietzsche realised that most people are just going to be incapable of doing this. He thought that most people were simply too weak to be able to do anything other than just slavishly follow what their society told them to do. So, by saying that the best types ought to just discard morality and live their lives to the full in light of moral values of their own choosing, he's not preaching anarchy. He's not expecting suddenly everyone to be running amok and just disregarding the Ten Commandments and things like that. So, when it comes to the question of the meaning of life, when it comes to Nietzsche's views on morality, again, it's the values that we ourselves bring and the meanings that we ourselves impose on our lives that are all important, the centrality of distinctly human concerns when it comes to this kind of thinking. You can also see Nietzsche's emphasis on the centrality of distinctively human concerns when it comes to what he has to say about epistemology, his theory of knowledge, what it is and how we can go about acquiring it, and when it comes to what he has to say about metaphysics, that is, what we might say about the ultimate nature of reality. More accurately, in Nietzsche's hands, his rejection of metaphysics. He rejected traditional Western philosophical accounts of the ultimate nature of reality. And this brings us to a challenging doctrine of Nietzsche's. It's sometimes called his perspectivism. And this concerns knowledge and the truth. Now, Nietzsche is often perceived to be what we might call a relativist when it comes to the truth. And he certainly rejects the notion of absolute truth. He rejects the notion that some things are true independently of us. Some things are true completely independently of our own practices and institutions. So he rejects the traditional sort of Western philosophical pursuit of the truth as something out there independent of us. Nietzsche notes that we human beings necessarily perceive the world and necessarily think about things from the perspective on the world that we happen to occupy. Each of us occupies a particular situation in the world, and that situation or perspective on things will inform what we take the world to be and what we think is going on. He also notes that the particular perspective or take on things that any one person happens to have is determined by that person's drives, as he puts it. Basically, their basic emotions, their basic desires, their basic psychology. So, as far as Nietzsche is concerned, there always has to be implicit mention of us and our perspectives when it comes to the question of the way the world is, how we take things to be, and what we think there is out there. Now, some interpretations of Nietzsche's doctrine here, typically postmodernist interpretations of Nietzsche's doctrine, take him to be making a very strong claim, a very radical claim. They take Nietzsche to be saying there's no such thing as the truth, full stop, either of an absolute kind or of any other kind. And consequently, they take Nietzsche's message to be that no one can say with authority that this view, that view, or the other view is correct. If there's no such thing as the truth, then what people are talking about when they're describing the world is really nothing more than their merely subjective take on things. And according to this reading of Nietzsche, there's no way we can authoritatively judge between the different things people say in a bid to identify whose views are to be preferred to whose. There are other interpretations of what Nietzsche's driving at with his perspectivism, though, with his claim that whenever we describe the world, we do so from our perspective, and consequently our concerns are going to be at the heart of the way we take things to be. There are other interpretations according to which Nietzsche is doing something more subtle and sophisticated than offering the radical view that there's just no truth and no one person's views are to be privileged over anyone else's. According to rival views of Nietzsche's perspectivism, he's not denying there's such a thing as the truth. He's not denying there's such a thing as knowledge that we can acquire about the world. And according to these views, Nietzsche is saying it is perfectly possible to acquire an objective picture of the way the world is. So we can, after all, get beyond mere subjectivity when it comes to what people say. Now, this won't be objectivity in the traditional sense, in the philosophical tradition in Western Europe. Objectivity was typically thought of in terms of the way things are independently of us and our concerns. Nietzsche thought objectivity in that sense was nonsensical. He thought that that view of what objectivity consisted in required a view from nowhere, which human beings simply can't achieve. Nonetheless, according to these interpretations of Nietzsche's perspectivism, he is saying that we can find out objectively the way things are, despite the fact that any one person's views are going to be informed by their perspective and prior to that, their drives. And the way we achieve objectivity is by adopting multiple perspectives on the way things are. We basically put on other people's shoes for a bit and think about how the world looks from their perspective as well. And once we do that, we start to develop a more complete picture. We start to develop a more rounded picture of what there is to be seen. And if this is what Nietzsche is saying, it's kind of like the advice that parents often give to young children. Try and think how that makes your sister feel when you take her toy off her, or whatever it is. When you do think about how you make your sister feel, you'll see that your initial take on things wasn't the be-all and end-all. So it's by accruing multiple perspectives, perhaps by imaginatively putting ourselves in other people's shoes, that we come to acquire that more rounded picture of the way things are. And on this view of Nietzsche's message, it's not the case that any one person's view is no better or no worse than anyone else's. Some perspectives can be rejected legitimately. How so? Well, the usual suggestion is that Nietzsche's view is that some perspectives that people have on things are distorting. They prevent people from being able to see what there is to be seen. So, to give an example of my own rather than Nietzsche's, you might get someone, for example, who has racist drives, which lead them to hold racist views about the innate inferiority of certain races or whatever it happens to be. Now, your average racist isn't very good at putting on other people's shoes and thinking about how the world looks from that person's point of view. And that, according to this interpretation of Nietzsche's message, is what often goes on in our pursuit of knowledge more broadly. It's people who occupy distorting perspectives that prevent them from occupying multiple perspectives that prevent them seeing what is there to be seen. So there's something of a debate about what Nietzsche's views about knowledge and the truth are. I've run past you two main interpretations of it there. Any which way, we can see again with his thinking about the truth and knowledge that, again, distinctly human concerns are central to our practices and our institutions. Nietzsche wants to move us away from what the church has to say about the way things are, what our everyday common sense morality has to say about the way things are. And so hopefully there you can see the theme running through Nietzsche's thought, not just with what he says about truth and knowledge, but what he says about morality and the meaning of life as well. That's more than enough from me, so I'll leave that there and we can open it up for questions.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So one hand's gone up, so go on, we'll take a few at a time as well.
Do you think Donald Trump has read Nietzsche? And if you apply perhaps the first approach to morality, is that where we end up with somebody like Donald Trump writing his own rules, post-truth? Maybe not necessarily seeing other people's perspectives always, but yeah.
Well, does Nietzsche fit today more than his own time, even with the loss of any idea of values and things like that? Any more? Go on.
What do you think a student could take away from Nietzsche's writings to guide them in their everyday life?
We were talking about religion and Nietzsche and the reasons for religion in the first place, which is to make sense originally of what's going on, and to try and lay down some basic rules. I'm thinking about some of the things like murder and theft, which are really important for a cohesive and calm society. Does he actually talk about any, does he go into any detail about actual morals like don't kill people?
Anybody else? Go on.
If Nietzsche thought that one reason that God was dead is because science had taken over, how does that square with his view there is no such thing as objective truth, because science is very much built on objective truth?
Yeah.
I was wondering what Nietzsche's views on nostalgia might be, because obviously that would fit with the transcendence of personal experience, but because it's obviously existing in a non-current temporal state, does that also apply? Or would that not count?
So can I just ask you to repeat the first part of that question?
Nostalgia.
Right. Okay.
I'll take one more at the back. There's two going to the back now. Go on.
So I was interested in what you thought Nietzsche's relevance is today.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting what you were saying about some perspectives can be rejected because they're distorting, and I wondered how you thought about that in the context of UK politics at the moment, where we have Boris Johnson, who's quite far on the right, and Jeremy Corbyn, who's on the left. So
I'll let you deal with them.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's some great questions there. Thank you very much indeed.
Can I ask something?
Yes, please.
I'm more like a Swedenborg fan, but I like to ask about something Nietzsche. I mean, he was a psychosis and a narcissistic guy, and what's his contribution to the transcendental world? I mean, what is actually why the university students learning from him? I mean, what is contribution? Because his ideas never been stable because he was ill-minded. I mean, I'm here just to see the view, but I never liked him.
Okay.
But yeah.
No, fair enough. Okay. So Donald Trump. I would love to see a Twitter spat between Nietzsche and Donald Trump. That'll be something to see. This, what I say here, will also relate to, what would Nietzsche have made of, the injunction, do not kill, as well. Because put it this way, at a first glance, it might look like Nietzsche is championing people doing morally monstrous things. You know, if our everyday morality is to be thrown out of the window, if people are just to come up with their own morality effectively, then surely that opens the door to nasty people doing horrible things and us not being able to touch them for it. I would think Donald Trump is potentially a good candidate to think about in that context. Now, I don't think Nietzsche would have liked Donald Trump at all, despite the fact Nietzsche wants to say the best types should discard our everyday morality. I don't think his message is therefore anything goes. Therefore, the door's completely open for people to behave exactly how they want without any avenue of recourse. He has quite a downer on mean-spirited people, and I think we can say equivalent things about what his views on Hitler would have been. He champions generosity of spirit, and he champions people behaving magnanimously towards one another. What Nietzsche has a downer on are certain motivations for action. So take, being generous to someone else. Nietzsche would say that if your motivation for being generous to someone else is that society says that that's what morality requires, he would think that's a poor motivation for being generous to someone else. But if your motivation for being generous to someone else is that that's just an expression of your high-minded, magnanimous character, great. I think he would give that a solid thumbs up. So I think he would take a very dim view, actually, of the acts of moral monsters, be they Hitler or less so far, Donald Trump. And he would do so because he diagnoses something that he calls elsewhere, their souls squinting in this kind of way. So that's my first hunch there. There's also interesting stuff to talk about in the context of Donald Trump about post-truth society and stuff like that. There'll be some further comments I can make under a different head from another question that will hopefully do something there. Does that chime at all with your thinking on that? Or?
That's interesting. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Righto. What else did we have? Yeah, takeaway guide for everyday life for a student. That came from somewhere over this part of it. Was that from yourself, sir? From yeah, right enough. So, the thing Nietzsche disliked most of all, I think, is what he took to be the bland mediocrity of contemporary culture. He was talking about second half of the 19th century German culture, but I think it applies today. He would think that the likes of me are just failing to live life to the full. And the likes of me do so because the bourgeois have a sort of fixation on security and safety first. They like mistaking their bland hobbies and pursuits for really interesting hobbies and pursuits and things like that. And it's that bland mediocrity of the bourgeoisie that I think Nietzsche reckons is really to blame for the stagnation of humankind and its failure to reach the cultural heights it once reached in yesteryear. So I reckon his takeaway message for a student studying Nietzsche is don't be fooled by your society into thinking that your bland lives are anything other than bland. That's what I reckon he would want his message to be. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. I mean, one thing I always think he's kind of trying to encourage people to take up the arts, and I think he's a kind of aesthetic take on things, because the noble spirits he's talking about are people, who are great writers,
Yes,
Goethe,
yes.
Dostoevsky, and so on and so forth. And I think that's one thing. I also, to some extent, I looked at the work of Max Stirner, and it's extraordinary how the disciples, as it were, in the English-speaking world of Max Stirner developed feminism, they developed gay rights, and certainly Dora Marsden, who was born not too far from here in the Cove Valley, she actually was a person behind many of the great modernist writers, such as Eliot, such as Joyce, and such as Yeats. So I think that but one thing that always intrigues me is this theory that, to some extent, he was a bit of a plagiarist of Max Stirner.
Right, no. Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah. I mean, you're quite right. Nietzsche certainly took the heights of culture to be largely artistic ones, whether that be literature or art with a capital A or sculpture or whatever it is. He, as many of you will know, he championed ancient Greece as the sort of the real zenith of cultural achievement, and it does seem to be. It's those kinds of artistic achievements that he has in mind.
Well, the Homeric bit. As soon as Socrates appears, everything goes down.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's where it all went wrong. Yeah, that's right.
I don't believe him. But
Good. Okay. So yeah, I've said something already about what Nietzsche might have to say about injunctions like "don't kill people." I think he would have. When he's saying we need to reject everyday morality, he's not wanting people to start running around murdering each other and that sort of stuff. Again, he wants to say, the language he uses is most often talking in terms of people saying a joyous yes to life. And I can't see how that's going to be compatible with, running round and anarchy ruling and people doing what they want whenever they want to do it. I think that's obviously that's just going to bring a descent into chaos and no flourishing whatsoever for mankind. So again, comes back to what one's motivations are. If your motivations for not killing someone are because the Ten Commandments says so, Nietzsche's going to think that's a bad motivation. Better motivations are available. Okay. There's a question on his views on science. I think that came from somewhere in that direction. Can the question asker remind me from yourself, sir? Cheers. So yeah, this is interesting. So Nietzsche's views on science are mixed. He says in terms of the practical output of science, yep, this is rigorous work he very much enjoys. He recognises science's role in improving the lot of mankind. But he also talks about science degenerating into what I suppose we could call scientism. He wonders whether science might be, or the scientific ideal might be the sort of ideal that go-getting noble types might usefully help themselves to, given the demise of religion. If the priest's ascetic ideal has gone out the window, where is the counter-ideal that's going to allow the best kinds of people to be able to say their lives have purpose and meaning? And he wonders whether the scientific ideal might be the answer here. But he soon rejects it. He says the scientific ideal that scientists today are embodying is in fact just another version of the doctrine of life denial that religions were peddling. And he explains that that's the case because scientists in his day were still talking in terms of finding out about the truth out there independent of us. Science took its job to be to find out about the real world that's supposed to exist independently from our lived experiences. And consequently, insofar as the science of his day did champion the pursuit of objectivity as it was traditionally conceived as the way things are independently of us, he had a dim view of that. But other conceptions of objectivity are there to be had. Those interpretations of Nietzsche's perspectivism, according to which he's not denying there's any such thing as the truth, he's not denying that we can acquire it, they take him to champion objectivity in the sense I explained earlier. You get a more objective view the more perspectives you occupy with respect to something. So he thought that there's maybe a bit of a Trojan horse with science, that what looks like a force for progress and for an improvement of our lot, in fact, might just perpetuate the kind of life-denying myths that what's important about life isn't us and our lived experiences, it's something that transcends it, and had a down on it accordingly. How does that square with your take on it, is it?
I was just interested in it.
Yeah.
Surely even Nietzsche's Superman can't disobey the laws of physics.
No, certainly not. I'm going to reach for the stars literally by jumping off this tall building and see what happens. That's right.
But they do keep changing.
Well, the history of science tells us this. Yeah, this is right. Okay. The next one asked about nostalgia. Now, remind me, who asked the question? Was that yourself? Can you put the question again so I make sure I've got it in mind?
It's fine. I was sort of wondering what his view on nostalgia would be, and kind of the dialectics, whether that's necessarily a positive, because you said that he kind of denies anything outside of the realm of lived experience, which obviously comes into that, but it isn't something that moves forward.
Yeah. So that's a really good question, and I'm going to have to make an answer up off the top of my head because I've not thought about it before. So there's times when Nietzsche appears to be nostalgic. He appears to be nostalgic for ancient Greek times. He appears to be nostalgic for the medieval Renaissance and stuff like this, these periods of real flourishing of human cultural output. At the same time, he is mindful in places to say, we can't just turn the clock back. So, for example, when he's looking at the origins of our everyday moral code, he diagnoses two kinds of broad moral outlooks from back in the day, what he called the master morality and the slave morality. The slave morality is sort of blindly doing what society tells you to do. The master morality was in yesteryear, sort of the jolly nobles gave themselves and their lifestyle a big pat on the back and deemed themselves to be good, and they were comfortable with their own existence and stuff like that. And Nietzsche reckons the slave morality came to dominate, and that's a complete disaster. He does say explicitly, we can't just turn the clock back. We can't just go back to the lives of the nobles of yesteryear and live our lives accordingly, because mankind has changed. Humankind has changed psychologically and in all sorts of other different ways, so that the historical and psychological conditions for gallivanting around the place like a hooray Henry, doing what you want and giving yourself a big pat on the back, they appear to have gone, although the current Prime Minister appears to be having a good go to recreate those days. So, I think you'd have rejected Romanticism, insofar as that's a nostalgic sort of mindset, but I suppose he'd have rejected Romanticism on the grounds that Romanticism gives no value to the progress that mankind has made. He says it's important that mankind made the progress it did, because that's going to be what allows us to reach for the stars. So yes and no, I don't know, and I've just made it up. Do you have any thoughts yourself on it?
No, I think that's really interesting. I think that answered it really well. Yeah,
cool. Okay,
thank you.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Anyone else? Oh, they're all going up now. Okay. 1, 2, 3.
Hi. So the example that you gave about, like at the very beginning about,
Speak up there. Speak
sorry.
up the airplane.
So about like people not acting moralistically because that's just what they've been told to do. So the alternative being, you know, finding your own way through your felt experiences, sort of experientially feeling your way. Will that not sort of be an ultimate truth, you might say, and sort of objectivity?
Yeah, good question. So what's the status of Nietzsche's claim here?
I was kind of wondering, obviously you mentioned the whole kind of notion of discarding morals and values of society, but I was wondering what then does he believe controls humans? Is there any control on humans? Kind of what extent are the beliefs that state control human? And kind of because the notion of society and control on the individual. Are there any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Okay. No, I'm fine. That's fine. Cheers.
We had a nice talk about Ayn Rand last year, and one's put in mind of that, of course, in this context. And Ayn Rand was running away from communism, or at least she was a refugee from that situation. And one's bound to ask whether Nietzsche was a refugee from the slowly developing conventions of social life of the 19th century, or whether you can identify any other of the factors that we should be suspicious about, coming from his own philosophy, essentially.
Was one comment about the loss of religion and Nietzsche's loss of religion. I'm very struck that he's writing in the 1880s, really, and the works of Arnold Bennett are set in the 1880s of his own youth, and that is exactly what happens to the semi-autobiographical characters that Arnold Bennett writes about. Is they come from very religious backgrounds, of the strict morality of Methodism typically, and they grow up and they see it and they're used to this structure. They have to go to chapel twice a week, 3 times a week, and it washes off them. They start reading French literature, and they ends up seeing it as just nothing. And it's interesting that I mean, I wonder if it was not a theme at the time, because I think if church attendance was declining in that period and people had lost, you know, there's still the trend that's really carried on to this day.
Yeah.
Do you know why Nietzsche went mad, and did he have syphilis, or is that a myth?
Yeah. Right, I know. Okay. So, let's have a look. Yeah, what's the status of Nietzsche's claims themselves? So he wants to say there's no absolute truth on the one hand. He also wants to commend certain ways of living one's life to those who are capable of doing so. So there's a potential paradox. Is that intended to be an absolute truth or what? So Nietzsche clearly thinks his own views are better than those of his rivals. And he thinks that there is often very good evidence in support of his views. So that, for me alone, suggests that he's not in the business of saying that everyone's views have an equal status. No one person's views can be authoritatively preferred to the next person's. In which case, what's he doing? Is he intending to offer an absolute truth when he says the best types should discard everyday morality and impose their own meanings onto life and live life to the full in light of those meanings, or what? My sense is that he's not so much in the business there of offering truths. He's in the business of trying to change how people behave. And he's going to try to do that by changing how they think, and he's going to do that by trying to change how they feel. So what he wants to happen is for the best types to do exactly what he says they should do. And he has got quite a deliberate sort of writing style that he takes to be well designed to achieve that. So if he was pushed in terms of the paradox, the second sort of interpretation of Nietzsche's perspectivism might offer us some thoughts about how he might try to do that. Given that he's denied there's such a thing as the absolute truth, if he's nonetheless saying, but there is still such a thing as the truth, it's going to be relative to our perspectives. Some perspectives are better than others. He's going to try to make a case for his perspective or take on things being better than those of his rivals. And that's what he does in various books. So he's going to try and do it that way, I'd have thought. But in the main, yeah, he's just in the business of trying to change how people behave by changing how they feel at the end of the day. Okay. Right, yeah, what controls humans? Remind me, who asked that question about society and control? Got the sense it was... Oh, that was it, yourself, thank you. So again, I'm kind of thinking off the top of my head here. Nietzsche does say certain things in various places about what drives human beings. He takes there to be certain ancient and powerful psychological drives that are common to all people, including, for example, the desire to inflict pain on other people and to enjoy doing that. And if you can't do that, then inflicting it on yourself in the form of religious guilt instead. He talks about the will to power, which he identifies as a driving force or principle that basically manifests itself in all of the expressions of human culture that takes place. That's not so much, well, it's not necessarily a drive to impose power on other people or to overpower other people. It's perhaps at its most general a drive to impose order onto things, whatever those things happen to be. So he thinks there's quite a lot of that going on. Now, one institution that the will to power will have brought about is our everyday morality. What Nietzsche's trying to say, I guess, is that that's not a very helpful manifestation of the will to power. There are more appropriate ways to try to exert your will to power than that. And for the best types, that's going to be imposing their own meaning onto life and reaching for the stars, and that sort of thing. Again, he's not preaching anarchy, so he's not expecting society to end anytime soon. He takes it the vast majority of people are just going to carry on business as usual. His message he takes to be for the best types, whoever they are, and that sort of thing. Does that address what you had in mind, or is there something further you were asking him?
Yeah, I think so. You do mention some good points.
Come back to me on it if you'd like to. That's absolutely fine. Is Nietzsche a refugee in some sense or other? That's a very good question. Again, making things up here on the spot. It kind of links to the subsequent question that was asked about whether people in general in Nietzsche's day were kind of fleeing from religion and that sort of thing. And I think that has to be there to be seen with Nietzsche, especially given that his father was a clergyman, and his writing looks like it was written by the son of a clergyman who got ended up wanting to run away from that religious authority and control and that sort of thing. Nietzsche also, I suppose, thought of himself as someone who had a really important message that no one was ready to hear. And I suppose in that sense, he's alienated from his own culture, his own society, and his own circles. You know, whether he was right to think that is another question, of course. But I think that's certainly how he conceives of himself. In especially thus spoke Zarathustra.
When you use the word bland mediocrity, is that actually a take from the text?
I don't think so, but I can't say definitively. But that
it's special pleading, isn't it?
Yeah.
Double.
Yeah. Does that address the thrust of your question as it goes?
I think partly, but clearly, I mean, one of the striking things is how people who feel that they haven't had the conch in their own time pick up advocacy in later years. I mean,
Yes.
it's very, very striking, particularly I was saying about Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
And whether that's to do with the quality of the material,
Yes.
or whether it's a reflection of their need
Yes.
that goes down the generation and speaks to other people's need,
Yes.
is interesting. I mean, the fact that Nietzsche is still interesting
Yeah.
is part of that heritage, perhaps.
That's right, and there's a very interesting history with Nietzsche, of course, that his rise to prominence came via the National Socialist Party in Germany misappropriating his message. And it was thereon after that he got into the public consciousness far more than he had during his lifetime. And we've got the explosion in interest in Nietzsche ever since those times. So a sort of a champion that Nietzsche would have been disgusted by championing him, leading to the current interest in him. That's fascinating. Okay, there was, the question about religion, I can't think of much more to say than I've said there. Is there any lingering aspect of your question?
No, sort of a similar question from a slightly different perspective. Whether it was a big movement at that time away from a general movement, or maybe he influenced it to some extent, and the idea spread from him.
So I mean, the kind of writing was on the wall, I suppose, that in all sorts of walks of life, the authority of religion had been in decline in Western Europe for some time, I suppose. So long as it was no longer the case, you had the Spanish Inquisition sort of trying people for heresy, then people were able to act, speak, think far more freely than they had previously. And it's there, that process starts long before Nietzsche, of course. I'm thinking of philosophers like George Berkeley in the sort of early 18th century complaining about the rise of free thinking and atheism and things like that. And I think that come Nietzsche's day, things are just accelerated under that head. Of course, I mean, I need to be careful not to focus on just Western Europe and one aspect of it too much, because globally, of course, the atheists are somewhat in the minority. And so I wouldn't want to over-egg the notion that, Nietzsche's right, religion's on the demise and stuff like that, but certainly in the bubble he was in, I think very much so.
Is The Apprentice a manifestation of Nietzschean philosophy and practice?
As in the TV show, right? My first hunch is that if you take if there's such a thing as your stereotypical apprentice contestant, I'm not certain Nietzsche would have had a great deal of admiration for that sort of contestant. I think he'd have seen a lot of posturing, a lot of artificiality, and a lot of dishonesty in the way a certain kind of budding business person presents themselves and their abilities and achievements. One of Nietzsche's main bugbears in life was dishonesty. So I don't think he'd have liked that aspect of it. But I'm presuming that you've got in mind at least one other aspect of it in terms of survival of the fittest, survival of the strongest, people who are the go-getters are to be championed and that sort of thing. And I don't think...
behaviour of the Superman.
Yeah, doing things your way, on your terms, and really having the gumption to wring out of life everything that you can on your terms and that sort of thing. That sort of thing he champions. Again, my first thought is that it strikes me the average contestant on The Apprentice is talking that sort of language, but not manifesting it in reality. And so whether he'd think it was just a sort of charade at the sort of things that he valued is another question. Oh, what an interesting question.
There was his death, what was it?
Oh, yes, syphilis, yeah. So I'm given to understand that the received view amongst Nietzsche scholars is that his mental degeneration and ultimate collapse was as a result of syphilis that he'd caught as a younger man, and the legend has it from the only sexual encounter he ever had with a prostitute when he was about 16. He was, 45 when he suffered his mental collapse. As I say, he was sickly, certainly throughout his life. Whether I'm a bit ignorant about his childhood and the likes, whether he was a sickly child. People here might well know more than I do about that. But yeah, that's what I've heard reported as the received opinion.
We've got time for probably for at least 2 more rounds of questions and comments. So I'll go 1, 2, 3.
I was reassured by a comment at the very beginning saying he's difficult to get your head around.
Yeah.
Do you have any recommended texts?
Yeah.
Particularly, I'm thinking of the title of this talk, My Contemporary Nature.
Yeah.
I'll take a few more first. Yep, down here.
You mentioned about religion and that it being a controlling behaviour. Does Nietzsche say anything about sexual freedom? About things like monogamy, poly, the freedom to just be expressive?
Yeah. Sure, okay.
On the subject of religion, I'm sort of coming from the other side, I suppose. His criticism of Judeo-Christian morality as being weak, I would, I know a lot of people haven't experienced Christian forgiveness in their lives, and that's a problem with the way Christianity is being practiced. But I mean, you look at some of Jesus' teaching, he talks about forgiving 7 times, 70 times. Genuine forgiveness, rather than just paying lip service out of cowing to a bully, is very difficult. And I would suggest genuine forgiveness is not a sign of weakness, but that is following Christian practice.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I guess we've heard about his response to religion and to science and his conflicted view on science. With his idea that the best types should sort of strive to do more, did he have any explicit view of what it meant to be like a political leader or of the political classes and whether it was right for them to be trying to steer large groups of people one way or the other?
Yeah. Okay. Righto, yeah, thanks for those. So first one was texts to read. There's a sense in which I'm the wrong person to ask that question too, because I'm a dry and dusty academic, and I like dry and dusty academic texts that are no use to anyone. In terms of a nice, accessible, but intellectually rigorous sort of text on Nietzsche, there's a philosophical biography on him by Julian Young. And I'm struggling to recall the title. It might just be Nietzsche or something like that, or Nietzsche Alive. But Julian Young's book I'd recommend as a worthy tome. Okay.
And Tanner's Oxford short intro is okay.
Yeah. In general, when I was first getting to grips with Nietzsche, I was just going for as many books with titles like Nietzsche, A Beginner's Guide, as I could. I found there's a series of books, isn't there, sort of give sort of cartoon overviews, as in through the medium of cartoons, not sort of rubbish overviews, but and there's one called Nietzsche for Beginners in that series, which is quite interesting as well. Okay. Did Nietzsche have anything to say about sexual freedom and that sort of stuff? Not that I'm aware of, but that might just be my ignorance. He does say some things about marriage. Usually he says quite disparaging things about marriage, but it strikes me that it's usually misogyny that's driving what he says in those places. In one or two places, though, I've come across some stuff recently when I was reading a bit of his book, The Gay Science, I think it was. Where he actually starts talking about marriage in really quite flattering terms, and distinguishes your common or garden everyday rubbish marriage from ideal marriages and that sort of stuff. So that's the nearest he gets in my acquaintance to talking about sexual freedom. I get the sense he was a fairly liberally minded chap, and so I would have expected if he has written on this or were to have written on this, he would be similarly liberally minded there. Okay. Christian forgiveness, yes. So yeah, I think we have to admit that Nietzsche's views on Christianity are somewhat one-sided and myopic. He, as you know, doesn't say very flattering things about Christianity at all, and kind of leaves all of the, love each other and forgive each other bit out of it. He forgets to mention that aspect of it. He does have quite a lot of time for the historical character Jesus, though. He often talks in quite flattering terms about Jesus the man and the likes. Obviously, there's somewhat more to the doctrine of Jesus in Christian orthodoxy. But yeah, he, if he were here today to contribute to this discussion by shouting and waving his arms around, he tends to interpret talk about, love thy neighbour and stuff like that as either dishonest one-upmanship, doing right by other people so that they do right by you later on, sort of thing. He has a big downer on pity and compassion in most people's hands and that sort of stuff. But yeah, the whole genuine forgiveness aspect of it, he passes over in silence.
I suppose I'm just challenging the notion that it's kind of weak. It's always a weak thing to do.
Yeah, it looks like a sweeping generalisation to me, what Nietzsche has to say about Christianity, and like any sweeping generalisation, misses out the details. Okay. So yeah, thinking about what Nietzsche might have, what his political, what his views on political leaders and stuff like that might happen to be. Yet again, I'm thinking off the top of my head here. So he doesn't give us anything akin to Machiavelli's The Prince or anything like that. So he's not making recommendations for how leaders of men ought to go about their business. He does have quite a lot of praise for Napoleon and the likes, but not so much in terms of because of his man management or anything like that, or his ability to lead people, but because of the magnificence of his achievements and that sort of stuff. So, yeah, I genuinely don't know, to be honest. Do you have any thoughts on it as it goes?
No.
Yeah. I'm going to have to keep an eye out for what he might say under this head in due course. That's a good question. And I think that goes to the end of that round.
Would you characterise Nietzsche as an Enlightenment figure or an anti-Enlightenment figure? Where does he sit in terms of Enlightenment?
Yeah.
You mentioned that he rejected the sort of transcendental view of morality, but the Enlightenment rejected a transcendental view of morality. The sort of idea of humanism, the human-centred morality.
Yeah.
And then in particular, how did it relate to the question of democracy and a collective self-interest developed through human beings in society?
Yeah.
And how did the influence of Schopenhauer relate to his perception of the idea of interest. Because my understanding of Schopenhauer is that he rejected the idea of interest as being capable of being a foundation for morality. So human beings are essentially unable to satisfy themselves through self-interest because things don't make you happy, material things don't make you happy. This is my reading of Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
So he rejected the Enlightenment, sort of humanism.
Good question.
Well, what's the difference between Nietzsche's dislike of dishonest motivation and Sartre's view that we should live authentically?
Yeah.
If he thought everyone was just a bundle of drives, just driven by drives, how did he view himself in that light?
Yeah.
How did he think that he overcame those drives somehow?
Yeah. Good.
Okay. Any other questions? No?
Just in terms of, could you say that Kerouac in On the Road developed a Nietzschean outlook in the sense that the morality was all about fulfilling yourself in the moment?
Yeah. I'll answer that question first. Yep. I've never read it. To my deep shame, it's been on my bookshelf for years and years. I've never read it, so I can't answer, I'm afraid. But there are some questions I can say something about. So yeah, what's his relationship to the Enlightenment? So yeah, so there is this deep humanism, I think, in Nietzsche, and insofar as that's an Enlightenment focus, yeah, he's certainly sharing that. In terms of his rejection of the transcendent, he analyses this being afoot in all sorts of different areas of life. Religion's the most obvious one. That what's most important is the here on after, not the here and now. To come back to something I said near the start of the talk, he rejected out of hand the general picture of the world that what we would call Enlightenment philosophers in Western Europe up to his time had all signed up to. So this notion again that there's our experiences are just in the head. The real world is out there, independent of us and our experiences, and what we need to do in philosophy is to put aside our experiences, or more realistically, get through our experiences in order to find out about that real world that's independent of them. And he would recognise that kind of story in the philosophy of, say, Descartes, John Locke, Immanuel Kant, and everyone in between. That focus he takes to be really unhelpful. This notion that it's somehow the other that we need to find out about. We need to get past ourselves in order to find out about the way things really are. That's just life denial as far as he's concerned. There is no reality independent of our everyday experiences. That's all there is, and any doctrine that claims otherwise is just in denial. And so, insofar as that's a common theme amongst a lot of Enlightenment philosophers, lots of champions of the Enlightenment, like Descartes and Kant, to name but two, that he rejects. However, he does think that didn't just come about with the Enlightenment. Plato was peddling it with, what we take to be reality is just shadows on the cave wall and that sort of thing. So I don't think he would have seen it as an Enlightenment problem or anything like that. There was a question about the relationship between what Nietzsche says about honesty and what Sartre says about authenticity. I'd read them as saying being in complete agreement here, that to lead an authentic life, don't live in bad faith, don't conceive of yourself in the way other people say you should conceive of yourself. Don't live your life in ways that other people say you should live your life. That's dishonest and, in Sartre's hands, inauthentic. Nietzsche talks about human beings needing to overcome themselves, needing to become what they are, and stuff like that. And what he has in mind when he's talking about that is we need to get beyond what other people say we should be. We need to get beyond what society says is the appropriate way for you to live a flourishing and healthy life. You need to get beyond that in order to release the real you and to become what you authentically are. So yeah, I see a lot of similarities between them.
He's an existentialist, isn't he, like Sartre?
You could easily apply the term to him, yeah. I mean, Sartre's far more explicit on it, but Nietzsche's certainly in this business. Again, Sartre says, existence precedes essence, and Nietzsche's going to agree. The notion that you have to be what society says you have to be, or that you are essentially this, that, or the other way, says society, therefore that's how you should behave, he wants to chuck out. That said, I think this might relate to one of the further questions. Drives, yes, indeed. So, yeah, we are just collections of drives. Nietzsche says that explicitly. And what people are endeavouring to do in their lives is to exert their will to power in manipulating the drives that they are and forming them and moulding them in various ways. Does that have any implications for how we ought to think of ourselves, or how Nietzsche ought to have thought of himself? Is he doing what he's doing simply as a function of whatever psychology he happens to have? I don't know whether he writes about this explicitly. I can't recall encountering him doing so, but he might have done. So he goes even further. He says, you are basically a result of your psychology, and your psychology is as it is because of your physiology. So what you had for breakfast is going to be determining, what's going on in your head, which is going to be determining the way you behave. So I suspect that if he was asked, he'd say, "Yep, that applies to me as well." Does that mean that anything goes? Does that mean that somehow undermines the status of the case Nietzsche is making for how the best type should go about their business? He wouldn't have thought it would. But then again, he would think that, wouldn't he? Because that's the way his drives impel him to think. So, good question. And there's all sorts of questions in Nietzsche about whether he can help himself to the authority that he sounds like he's undermining in other places by saying the things he does.
Is there any... we've got time for a bit more, so is there any final questions or any final points or any final contributions? Go on.
Do you think that Nietzsche was a reductionist, a sophist? What got me thinking was when you mentioned Plato, and in fact the problem of reductionism was, as much as anything, solved by a scholar before Nietzsche's day called Aristotle.
I've heard of him.
And Aristotle would have said that somebody who just looks at the world in terms of Nietzsche did, in terms of subjective drives and his mystical experience, by like Silva Plana, that nature mysticism which experience he had, that is very narrow, because he couldn't, for example, understand the world of logic and mathematics. He couldn't understand Boolean and symbolic logic, could he? He couldn't understand any of that. And yet we've got computers and all of the whole economy, which is based upon that other level. So that's the top level, as it were. Okay?
Yeah.
It's not just Platonist ideas.
Yeah.
There's logic and mathematics.
Right.
Below it, of course, is a physical world, and we know a lot more about the physical world than the biological world. You know, to some extent, he got a bit excited by Darwinism, but there's so many variants and developments of that now. And of course, you know, the whole he talks about signs and sign systems, and I kind of get excited reading this stuff. So then he kind of goes away.
Short question.
He goes away. So my answer is: don't you think? Question then: do you think he was reductionist, sophist, and Protagoras would have right?
Okay.
Good luck with all that.
Okay, righto. So, for me, this boils down to the question of what Nietzsche was trying to achieve. And I think a lot of your critique there would certainly be appropriate if what Nietzsche is trying to achieve is to tell it the way it is, to offer us his account of the way the world actually works and, you know, what we can know about it and that sort of thing. He claims he is. Yeah, he's claiming to give us a documented history based on fact and stuff like that. So, conspiracy theory is the wrong word. There's a line that some Nietzsche scholars take, according to which that's not what Nietzsche's trying to achieve. Nietzsche's not, in fact, trying to tell it like it is, even though he says he is. That's all part of his ruse. According to this line of thought, what Nietzsche's wanting to do is, again, just change how people behave. And he reckons that his methods, which are often taken to be quite artistic methods to do with the literary conceits that he uses, are all there to try to mess with people's feelings.
Is that the esoteric approach then? You say?
Yeah, you could call it esoteric. I don't know about that, but yeah. So
Strauss and Lampert.
Yeah, you've got the better of me here, I'm afraid. But yeah, according to this view, Nietzsche, if he'd wanted to, could have written fairly straightforward philosophy books with reasoned argument systematically laid out with premises and conclusions. I have no doubt that he was competent at logic and he was competent at reasoned argument. He just chose not to use them as the tools he was going to use. If that's right, and there's a big debate about that, but if that's right, then I reckon that probably gets him off some of the hooks that you've hung out for him there.
Yeah, I like your argument. Yeah.
Okay, well, as I say, it's a matter of debate, so I don't claim to be solving that one. Okay.
Liking your argument is a good place to end, so thank you very much to Nick for that.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
To the Tetley and the audience as well. The first quote you came out with was actually, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Somebody did write a letter into Viz once saying, people say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but my cousin was a world champion weightlifter until he was hit by a BT van and now he drinks his food through a straw. So it doesn't always make you stronger. So the second talk in the series is on 30th of November when we welcome back Nikos Sotirakopoulos of the previous Ayn Rand talk from last year from York St John University to discuss the Jordan Peterson phenomena. Why is he so loved and loathed? And is he the champion of free speech and science and rationality that he claims?